Welcome to our practical learning session where we were going to test out the fundamentals of ASP.NET Core. But before we proceed, I would like you to make sure you have .NET SDK installed on your system. If you do not have, you can come to the URL here and you can download either the version 6 or the version 7. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll be using version .NET 6 and a 64-bit version. If your system is a 32-bit machine, you can actually download the 32-bit version here. Or if you want to try out something and you want to play more, you can get the .NET 7. Do it in release state. This is a release candidate state. You can check that out. It's still good. But for the purpose of this demo, we will be utilizing .NET 6.0. So to follow along in this learning series, I would actually recommend you download .NET from the URL on the screen and to follow along. Another tool you may likely need is Visual Studio Code. I'll be using Visual Studio Code. If you're using a Mac, you can download the Mac version here. Or if you're using Linux, you can download the Linux version here. I'm going to be using I'm using a Windows machine for this purpose, so that is another tool that you're going to be using, Visual Studio Code. Another tool you may find handy but not necessary is trying out the Windows terminal. You may use your default PowerShell or command line that comes with your, or the command line or the shell that comes with your operating system. That is good enough. And basically, those are the three tools I'm using for this demonstration purpose. So you need the .NET SDK installed for you to proceed. You need to install .NET SDK and make sure it's working on your platform. So, and you need Visual Studio Code. All right, so let's delve in and start coding. All right, so this is my Windows terminal, and I would like you to first and foremost, let's see, to actually certify that we have .NET installed. I want to show you that I have .NET version 6.04 installed on my machine. That is the version of .NET that I'm using. And when you install .NET, I think you should test out the version to be actually sure that you have .NET installed on your machine. So once you install the SDK here, the CLI is pre-bundled with the SDK. So if you install the SDK, you will have the CLI out of the box. All right. So the next thing I want to show you, I have an empty directory here called ASP.NET Core Projects, and that is where we are going to, that's the directory we are going to be working in. And I'll come back to my terminal and I'm going to change to that directory. So let's go inside the directory. Actually, you can see there's nothing in the directory, it's an empty directory, and that's where we will start out our business. All right. So the very first thing we will do is I need to create out an empty ASP.NET project template. And to do that, I just need to do .NET new and say web. But that will create, running that command will actually create the project template in the default directory, and that's not what I want to do. So basically what we will do is I'll create a directory, make dir, and I will say, just make mkdir sample ASP demo. All right, let's do that, sample ASP demo. And let's sample web. Let's use that, and that is okay. And the next thing we should do is we can come in here, we can change the directory to cd sample web, and we are there. You can go inside and make sure that, check that nothing is inside. Then we can go here and say .NET new web. All right, and that will go ahead and bootstrap an empty web project for us to actually use. All right, so you see that uses the ASP.NET Core empty template and creates out a project for us. So if we come in here and ls list the directories, you'll see we have an object directory, you have properties, we have app settings, development.json, we have app settings.json, you have the program.cs file, and we have the sample web project.cs project, the sample web.cs project itself. The next thing we should do is we can open Visual Studio. So to open Visual Studio is just go in and start code, and that should open Visual Studio for me. Yes. All right, so we are currently in our Visual Studio code environment. Let's close this, and we have the sample project. Let's inspect this file. So this file is basically all we need to run a web application or build a web project in ASP.NET Core, and it has a builder, and the builder actually bootstraps the necessary configurations to build a web application, and the build method actually returns a web application. And we can go in here and map the web application to an endpoint. This is an endpoint, and we just call run, and that is all we need to do, and the web application actually runs. So let's open our terminal, and here, and we can come inside here. All we need to do is .NET run. So let's do that, and that builds up our project. So, and that is all we need to do. And we can open you can grab this link, you can control click to open it, like this. It will open a project for us, and it says hello world. I believe you've seen that. And so we can actually expand, and you can see that is our project, and it says hello world, and that is basically what I need you to see. And that is done by only one line of instruction here, and that is what we get from the project. I would like this to be side by side with this screen so that we can have a look at it. So our project is hosted on localhost port 7230, and that is what is enlisted here, 7230. And we can minimize this to have more room to play around. So typically this is how we start, or this is the basic template for building any type of ASP.NET Core web application, whether it's an MVC web application or whether it's a Razor-based web application, or it is a web API application. So this is the basic template for bootstrapping all ASP.NET Core projects. And let's play around with this so we can have the basic idea of how ASP.NET works. So what actually happens is that, if you remember from the documentation we were doing, we had a context object from Kestrel handed over to your application code, and that had some particulars, had a path and a whole lot of configurations associated with it, and had middlewares, we had configurations, and that is what I want to show you in the series. So let's actually stop this process. Control C would shut down the process, and let me go ahead and increase this for you to appreciate and see what we are doing actually. So here we will, this is the very first endpoint, and here this returns, sorry, let me start from the beginning. So we have a builder here, so this returns a web application builder, something that builds a web application. All right, that is what that line of code actually does. And we can increase this for the moment. We will be back here. All right, so that is what that line of code does, and we can remove this. We don't need it. And the builder, when you call the build method itself, the build method here actually returns a hostable web application. All right, that is what happens. So if you put your cursor here, you notice that builds the web application, returns a configured web application. So this is a web application. Once you call this method, it builds a web application that is pre-configured, and you can run it like this. That is what we need to do. So the very first thing that happens, that this line of code will return a hostable or a pre-configured. Let's use the word pre-configured. That is important. Pre-configured web application. And here we have this the third line, which is number 4, line 4, actually hits a particular endpoint. So let's open the browser again, and let me show you something. So let's open this, and let's come to function F12, I think so. So F12 here, and I can show you the no. Oh, sorry, I actually stopped my application. Let's run it again and open terminal. Let's do that here, and we can just issue .NET run. Let's use watch run. Watch run allows us to make changes and still keeps to gives us hot reload. Let me use the word hot reload, and that is what we get. So let's do .NET watch run, and that is good. We have application running, and that is good. All right. So here I'll press F12, function F12, and I want to show you something. Let me close this, and let's come here and let's refresh this. When we refresh this, you notice this is the initial request that hits this URL, and the endpoint for this is actually the path. So the path here is where we get the hello world return. So let me show you another thing. So here, if I come in here and put another path, and I would say welcome. Let me say welcome path, and I would say hello. Then we'll say welcome to developing. Welcome to developing ASP.NET Core. Sorry, ASP.NET Core applications. All right. So that is the second endpoint. We'll restart this. We'll just save when you save this file. Because we are using .NET watch run, we have hot reload, and that will make the changes applicable at the moment. And so we can come in here, and we can come in here and actually hit the welcome URL and see. I think that is capital. Let me check. What we did is welcome. All right. That is welcome. That is not. I'm coming. Let me check. Welcome and not get welcome. That's the last thing here. Welcome. All right, let's do this. Control C. Run it again. .NET watch run. I don't know why that is happening. So basically we have this here now, and we can come here and refresh welcome. So I want to show you something critical. So we have welcome, and we have welcome to developing ASP.NET Core applications, and you notice the part here is actually welcome. So this hits the welcome endpoint in our application, and that is basically that is the endpoint that gets this message. So if you come to the first endpoint here, which was the root point, you get hello world. And when you come to welcome, and you get a different message totally. So that is what you can, that is the endpoint path that is what that line of instruction actually does. And that is, so if you can have as many endpoints as possible that actually pertain to some section of your code. You should listen to my series, which is Web Development Fundamentals, at which I talk about endpoint as well. And this is pretty much what you need to actually start out an ASP.NET web application. And it's a few lines of code, and this is an empty project. It does nothing. Then just print out that message. Now, remember when we talked about ASP.NET Core, we actually mentioned two things. We did talk about configurations, and we did talk about middlewares. And we told you that configurations are required, where you can build required services, and middlewares are things you inject into extra portion of code you inject into the pipeline to perform certain specific functions. And that is what I want to show you in this learning series. Understanding these fundamentals will give you the ability to go ahead and learn more the templates in the ASP.NET ecosystem, such as the MVC template and the Razor pipeline template. In a little while, I'm going to show you as much as possible to give you a perfect foundation on understanding about building applications, web applications using ASP.NET Core. So the run function here actually runs the application on a host, and this binds to the default port that is, I didn't specify this port. You can specify the port you want or the URL it should bind to, but that is the default. So just calling run, it actually runs the application in the default port. And basically this runs application, runs the web application. So we can use the word execute the web application. And what happens is that when you send a request, like we did, the request is translated into a context object, as I explained, by Kestrel, and handed over to your application code. So this is your application code. Your application code has a set of middlewares, and the request object travels through this middlewares and a response. When it hits a terminating point or an endpoint, a response is generated and returned back to the core of the code. And that's what happened when you hit this point. The request travels along the pipeline and gets to here and gets a response, hello world. And when a request comes into a welcome endpoint, it gets hello, welcome to developing ASP.NET Core applications. Basically, that is what I'm trying to say. When you send a request from your browser, or when a user agent sends a request, that is the whole process that it follows. So the very first thing I want us to learn how to do is we're going to build on how to inject services. Because I told you there are 3 drivers for your application, and one is configuration, 2 is routing, and the third thing is hosting. And configuration is this line of code actually builds the default configuration with the dependency injection containers and everything that your application needs to work with. And mapping here actually has to do with routing, which is this is inject services. This will be configuration, and here would be routing. All right. And here will be hosting. So basically that is what the 3 concepts or the 3 drivers of ASP.NET we need to focus on. So the app builder the builder.build actually bootstraps the default configuration or pre-configures the web application class for handling requests. So this part of the code, we will actually create a new folder and we'll call it custom services. And inside custom services, we'll define a new file called sample service or CS. And in here, we will build, the very first file we will build is public. Let's put this inside a namespace. Custom services, sample web, that is it, sample web dot custom services. Sample web dot custom services. And that is the default namespace we'll be using. And here we'll declare a interface. First thing we'll build is an interface, public interface, iSample web, iSample service, like that. The interface will have one method, public string do something like that. That is basically what it will have, and that is the very first. Let me use the word custom service here. Custom service, and that is the very first thing I'll build. And let's rename this into custom service. Alright, so we have the custom service like that, public interface I custom service, and public string do something. The next thing we will do is we'll build a class like something that extends that. We say custom service. This class extends I custom service like that, and we will implement the public string do something method. And here we will just do a basic thing like returning this string welcome to ASP.NET Internet Application Development. Internet Application Development. That is fair. That is fair. And that is what we need to build. So we have defined a custom service, which is traditional to what most of the service pre-configured for you by ASP.NET. And here, before we actually build this, we need to always inject our services. This should always happen before you build the application. So that is where you traditionally inject your services. So we can say builder.services dot add scope. Let's put scoped, and we pass in on our service, our custom service. Like that, and we pass in the custom service we've designed. We've crafted. And that's all we need to do, and finish, and we can have using custom services. And that is a typical way of we can do this. So when we hit the welcome endpoint, instead of returning this, we can bootstrap a lambda expression by going there and getting, let's do this using scope, because this line of code is injected into the dependency injection container that is pre-configured when you build, when we build the bootstrap the web application. So using for scope, so we can go ahead and use the dependency injection container that is pre-configured for us. For scope, app.services create scope. That is what we need to do. And here we can say vars services, services or service equals to scope dot service provider dot get required service. Here we'll pass in the I custom service like that, and that's all we need to do. Then we can simply do return. We can call on return. Let's use this return service dot do something. So typically that is how you can configure your services, and you can use your services in here to perform a certain task. So let's run our application again, and here we can we should reduce this so that we can have more room like that. Alright, that's fair. That is fair enough. And we can get .NET run. Let's see what happens when we build the application, and let's see what's the response we get now from the application. So basically, while we're waiting for that, let me explain what happens. So you have this configuration, and you have this routing use this service you've pre-configured here, and that is basically what ASP.NET is about. So you have the context object passed from one component to the other, and we will have a look at what the context class is actually in this scenario. Control C, and let's save this. I'm not sure this is .NET watch run. Yeah, I think so. That's correct. Let's have hot reload configured in it, and we can, yeah, that is welcome to hello world. Let's have this side of the screen on, and let's hit the welcome endpoint, and all right. So welcome to ASP.NET Internet Application Development. That is the one. This was old dummy data. Okay, so that is what we need to. That's so we can use our services. We can inject our services that way. And so, all right, let's add a little refactoring to our application so you can have a better idea about a better learning experience about most of the services you'll be using in ASP.NET Core. So here I'm going to add. Let me come to custom services. And let me add another file here. I'll call it let's call it custom dependency config, or let's just call it dependency config. Dependency config. That's the name of the file. .cs, and that's what I want to call it. Then in doing that, I will just do the same thing, copy this namespace here, come in here and put it in here. Sorry, I didn't copy it properly. So I will copy this now and put it here. Then I'll close the namespace, that is proper. Then I'll create a class, public static class, we'll call it dependency config. Sorry about the typo. Dependency config, and that is the name of the class, and we'll terminate it like that, and it's formatted properly. So that is the name of the file that will contain our dependency configuration. So we'll have just one method here, public static void add custom services. Let's use the name, and this will reference the iService collection, which is inside the pre-configured DI that is bootstrapped in the default ASP.NET project template, which is inside the web application, as you all know. So call service collection. So we'll put the service collection here. We start, and in here we can come to our program.cs file and copy just this line, and come back here and reference the service collection and put it here like that. That is good. And we go ahead and save the file. So to use this dependency in our application, all we need to do is we can come in here and just add custom. We can come in here, custom services. Okay, the name pops up, and that is all we need to do, and our application still functions the way it needs to. So we can go ahead and write .NET watch run, sorry about typo, watch run, and we will definitely have the same result as usual. So here you can add services you've built, or some functionalities that are offered in the .NET platform or that ships with ASP.NET project templates. So you can add them and use them for your project. So we'll hit our endpoint welcome as usual. and you still get the same message, welcome to ASP.NET Internet Application Development. And that is all we need to do for now. I think that was correct. Yeah, that was correct. So that's what we need to do for now. So another thing that I would like us to do in this is that I'll go ahead and bootstrap another project template. So you can see how we can add more functionalities, and you can have a good idea about how most of the services in ASP.NET work and what happens in between. So right now you should understand that we have Kestrel. When you have a request, hit Kestrel. Kestrel translates the request into, I need to show you that. All right, so what we've done actually, you remember we have our request object, and our request hits this endpoint, and it comes from the browser to Kestrel, and Kestrel generates a HTTP context object and hands over to our application. So that's what happens. And in a project, which is this, we see we have this web application class in here, and we have this. So once the request hits this class, the pipeline hits this endpoint, the HTTP context object is the HTTP context object is handed over to this pipeline. And what makes this happen is that the pre-configured web application comes with a default use routing and use endpoint settings automatically, just like we said, add custom services. I would bootstrap another project so you can have a better idea of what I'm talking about. But for now, I think this is the basic configuration for you to understand what ASP.NET is about and what an endpoint is actually, and how you can perform or inject some form of services into your HTTP or into your web application. All right, and let's move on. So the next thing I want us to talk about is how we can have access to the HTTP context object we were talking about during the presentation. Okay, so let's do something else. Let's terminate this process here. Let me introduce you to the concept of middleware. So actually this routing section are actually middlewares. All right, so this is a middleware that provides us with an endpoint where we can direct a request to. But there is something I want to show you. Let's do this here. Okay, before we do that, let me explain something. Let me come back here and let's come to this presentation. And remember that when Kestrel constructs a HTTP context object, it hands over to your application code. And your application code sends the HTTP context object to a set of middleware components and returns a particular result. Remember this. So what are actually middleware components? We specify that middlewares are an application code that can access the HTTP context, but outside that, it is also a piece of software that injects some form of functionality into your application. And let me show you something. When we, I think we can, 1 second, we already went through this. Okay, when we talked about the middleware components, we did say that it is a request pipeline like this. So you can have requests transfer from one point to another. And we came up and I talked about using passing requests through a middleware and getting a response back. At this point, you can understand that the whole HTTP context object travels through a middleware. And what actually is a middleware? A middleware is a type of computer software that provides services to software applications beyond those available from the web. So forget about it. Actually, a middleware is something in the pipeline that handles requests, performs some form of operation on the request object or the response. I did say that. Now we already have these middlewares here, which app.get is used by the routing middleware. But let me do something. So I'm going to write app.run, and this time I'm going to use an async keyword to have access to a lambda function that is basically in a different type of middleware. And here I will pass in the context object like this. So that gives me access to the context object. Sorry. and control there, that is it. And we can have that function. Okay, so next we can say await, which is await, grab the context object, go into grab the request or response object, and write to it, write async, and put this is a terminal response to all requests on this application pipeline. So why am I showing you this? All right, so this is a sample. This is a middleware that we're just injecting in. This line of code is a piece of software, and I'm having access to the context object. Like I earlier said, when Kestrel builds a HTTP context object and hands over to the application code, which consists of a set of middlewares. Right, so this is the HTTP context object, and I told you the HTTP context object has a group of properties. So you can see it has a request, has a response, it has a session, and has user, and a whole bunch of properties as well. And we can come in here and say that you notice that I'm accessing the HTTP response property, which is also a HTTP response object, just like you could access the request object. That's the same thing. And we tell it whatever request comes in, just send a report. And you'll notice that we'll not be able to reach the hello world again, because this middleware comes in before the map get and the map gets to the root and the welcome. If you remember this analogy, this pipe request must pass through here, meaning request must pass through middleware 1, middleware 2, and a particular middleware may actually terminate a request and issue a response without allowing the request to pass through to different aspects of the softwares in this pipeline, the request pipeline. So that is what I'm trying to demonstrate. So let's come here and run, save this, and run this application again, and just see what the response actually is. So while that is bootstrapping, another way we can have access. Okay, beautiful. So you say like this is a terminal response to all requests on this application pipeline. All right, there's a typo here. There's a typo here in response. And even though this is the root endpoint, let's go into our function F12. Let's go into our network tab, and let me show you something. If I hit welcome endpoint, and I still get the same response. Meanwhile, I am actually at the welcome endpoint. If I come back to the root endpoint again, I still get the same response because I'm still at the root endpoint. And that is what that middleware actually does. So middleware is a piece of functionality or software that does something on the application or the request pipeline. So ideally, you should not, the .NET documentation does not recommend us to use the run middleware or run functionality to execute middleware. It actually recommends we use the use method to actually inject middlewares into our application. And if let's comment this out, and restart our application, and probably we should have a different result. All right, so it says hot reload. Let's refresh this. As usual, I don't know why the hot reload doesn't give me what I want. So let's end this and go ahead and run this again. This time we should be able to hit the appropriate endpoint for our application. All right, so that is, you can see we now hit hello world, and we can go ahead and go to welcome, and welcome to internal application development. All right, so that is what a middleware actually does, and that's what I want you to understand. It allows you to inject some form of functionality, as we earlier described here, some form of logic, And most times you can write middlewares that perform operation on object and hand over the context to another middleware to do something or to perform some form of logic in it. And that's what I want to show you. So let's come back to Visual Studio. So the first one we tried out was as app.run. So the next middleware I'm going to inject in this application is I'm going to make use of the use method. The use method here actually allows you to also inject a middleware function and pass it to the next middleware. So here we are going to use, let me use the async keyword and wrap it inside a lambda expression. And here we will do this. All right. And doing this, we'll pass in a context object as usual, and we'll pass in the next delegate function. So we can call either the context object or the next delegate. And here we can, let me put this down so I can understand properly. So you have app use, and app use here actually takes in a context and the next delegate. So we are using add a middleware delegate defined inline to the application request pipeline. That is basically what it does. So let me show you up here. So remember that this is a request pipeline, and we have a, assuming this is a delegate, assuming this is a middleware and this is a middleware, this could be a, so the next delegate actually allows you to, once this middleware is done, it passes it to the next the next middleware in the pipeline. So you understand that in this part, so you have middleware 1, middleware 2, and middleware 3. So you have a request coming inside the middleware and some logic in the middleware, and you have pass it to the next middleware, and that is what the next delegate actually does, and that is what I want to have a look at. So let's come back to our project, and we have that. So here we are going to perform some logic, and as usual, and once we are done with the logic, we would pass in await, and we'll call in the next function, call the invoke method here. That is the proper thing. So await next invoke. And the next thing we should do, we can have some logic here, and we can also have some logic after passing to the next middleware. All right, so we can have logics in here and there, and actually to show you that there is some form of logic that actually in here, we can use the console application console. So this is a console, and put the right line, and I could say this is the first middleware, and we can go ahead and execute pass into this hello world. Or let's do this, let's come in here and grab this run. Let's not do that, let's do this, let's come in here, use, let me show you something, and we'll create another middleware async, and here we pass in context, and we pass in the next delegate as usual, and here we can show this, and here we can go ahead and wait and call the next function and pass in invoke it. All right, that we can do that there. I want you to see what happens. By doing this, I want you to have an idea of what is going to happen. So we would write a form of logic, Control C, and put it here. Let me not use the console here. Let me use different components here for you to have an idea about it. And probably not even before the delegate invokes. Let this not do anything, but just pass in the request to the next app.logger, call the logger, the default logger, to log this information into the console for us to see. I am the second delegate in the pipeline, the second custom delegate, or second custom middleware, sorry, and I am passing the request to the next, and I have passed, let me use the word, because, and I have passed the request to the next middleware, and the next middleware actually is going to hit the app.get middleware endpoint, and that is what I wanted to log. So we can see that we're having two middlewares here. This is the first middleware, it will print on the console. This is the first middleware, and once that gets in passing to the next one, you could see the series of messages before we hit the hello welcome world, or hello welcome. Run that and see how that looks like. .NET run, and let's see what is the response we get. So okay, so this is what we get. So let's go into a console and have a look at it. So you notice that we had the first message. This is the first middleware using the console native functionality to write to the console. And here we pass into the second middleware, which uses the logger, default logger, to log that information to the console. I am the second custom middleware, and I have passed the request to the next middleware, which is actually hello world. And if we come in here and actually hit the welcome, you'll notice the request will actually go through the same messages again. So this is the first middleware, and you see this is the second custom middleware, and I have passed the request to the next middleware. All right, so basically that is the concept of middleware, and that is what I want you to understand. You can write some form of logic to perform some form of manipulation on the request object before and after passing it to the next component or the next middleware in the request pipeline. And that is the basic fundamental knowledge I wanted you to understand about middleware and configuration. So we've made use of configuration by adding a custom service here, and we actually made use of a simple middleware, a custom middleware that can pass into the next middleware in the pipeline, request pipeline, and till we get to a terminal middleware and the response is gotten back. Now that is what I wanted you to have an idea about when we are talking about request pipeline in ASP.NET. So for this series, we've done configuration, middlewares, and we actually hosted the web application. So let's go to another project's template and actually see the effect of all these components come into play and how you can use these components in your application.